My 4-year-old son proudly brought my mother-in-law a slice of homemade cake during our family gathering. She pushed it onto the patio and told him, "Don't call me Grandma." A few hours later, a visit to the hospital led to a family truth none of us expected. The plate hit the flagstone at 2:47 in the afternoon. I remember because I looked at my watch out of pure instinct, the way you do when something breaks and some clinical part of your brain starts logging facts before your heart catches up. The lemon cake I'd baked that morning slid across the patio in a pale yellow smear, the raspberry filling bleeding into the grout lines like something out of a crime scene photo, which, looking back, it very nearly was. Mason stood there in his little navy button-down, the one Julian had ironed himself the night before, and he looked down at his empty hands like he couldn't understand where the plate had gone. He'd carried it so carefully across the whole yard, both hands, tongue between his teeth in concentration, past the string lights and the folding tables, all the way to Eleanor's chair. "I made you a whole slice, Grandma," he'd said, "the biggest one." Eleanor Whitfield did not raise her voice. She never did. That was the thing people never understood about her. They thought cruelty had to be loud to be real. She simply looked at the cake, looked at my son, and said, in the same tone she used to correct a waiter's pour, "Don't ever call me Grandma again. You are not my family." Then she kicked the plate off the arm of her chair with the toe of her cream-colored flat, and 31 relatives went completely silent in a backyard in Lake Oswego, Oregon, on a Sunday that was supposed to be about nothing more than my father-in-law's 70th birthday. She simply looked at the cake, looked at my son, and said the words in the same tone she used to correct a waiter's pour. "My name is Vanessa Hartley. I'm 32. I'm a clinical pharmacist at Providence St. Vincent, and I have spent 11 years training myself to notice the small deviation before it becomes the large emergency. I read labs the way other people read faces. I watch for the number that's off by a fraction, the interaction nobody flagged, the thing that looks fine until you know exactly where to look. It's a skill that serves me well at work. It has served me even better, I would come to learn, at home. I married Julian Hartley 6 years ago. He's a structural engineer, steady, quiet, the kind of man who reads the fine print on everything, except, it turned out, his own mother. We built a life in a Craftsman on a tree-lined street off Lakeview Boulevard. We drove a used Volvo we were slowly paying off, and we were, by any reasonable measure, happy. Eleanor never approved of any of it. Not the house, not the neighborhood, not me. She'd wanted Julian to marry a woman named Priscilla Whitcomb, whose family owned half of a shipping logistics company out of Tacoma, and whose mother sat on 3 different charity boards with Eleanor. When Julian brought me home instead, a nurse's daughter from Gresham with student loans and a second-hand Honda, Eleanor looked at me the way you'd look at a stain you were deciding whether to bother treating. "She's ambitious for someone with so little to be ambitious about," she told Julian once, thinking I couldn't hear her from the kitchen. He never repeated things like that to me. I found out later he'd been absorbing them alone for years, the way you absorb weather. When Mason was born, I told myself a grandchild would soften her, the way it does for most people, the way it's supposed to. It didn't. She held him once, at the hospital, for exactly as long as the nurse insisted, and handed him back like he was a phone she was returning to a stranger. She sent gifts to her other grandchildren, Priscilla's children, whom Julian's brother Trent had gone on to marry into that same shipping fortune. Mason got nothing. Not a card, not a call on his birthday. "Mommy, does Grandma not like little boys?" he asked me once, and I told him the kind of gentle lie you tell a 4-year-old, that Grandma was just busy, that some grown-ups take longer to warm up. I didn't know yet how close that lie was to being an actual crime scene cover story. In the 2 weeks before that birthday party, Eleanor had started calling me directly, which she never did. She asked, with unusual specificity, whether Mason had any food allergies. She asked what he'd eaten for breakfast the morning of the party. She asked, almost offhandedly, whether I was still planning to bring one of your cakes. I told my sister Renee about it over the phone, and she said what I wanted to hear, that Eleanor was probably just trying, in her cold, stunted way, to finally connect. I wanted to believe that so badly I ignored the part of my brain, the pharmacist part, that flags the deviation before it becomes the emergency. Eleanor had never once, in 6 years, asked me a single question about my son's health, and suddenly, she wanted to know everything about what was in his bloodstream. The morning of the party, Mason helped me in the kitchen, standing on his step stool, sifting powdered sugar with a concentration usually reserved for surgeons. "Do you think Grandma will finally like me today?" he asked, and I had to turn away and pretend to check the oven so he wouldn't see my face. We arrived at the Whitfield house on Green Tree Road at noon. Julian's father, Bennett, was 70 that day, still sharp, still warm in the distracted way of a man who'd spent 40 years running a commercial real estate firm and had never quite learned how to be present for the smaller moments of his own family. The yard smelled like hydrangeas and charcoal smoke. Trent's kids ran through the sprinkler in matching Ralph Lauren swimsuits, while Mason sat carefully on the porch steps in his ironed shirt, holding his plate, waiting for his turn. And then, at 2:47, it happened. Exactly the way I've already told you. The plate, the words, the silence. What I haven't told you yet is what happened 40 minutes later, on the drive home, when Mason, buckled into his car seat, complained that his stomach hurt. "Mommy, my tummy feels really bad," he said, and his voice had gone thin in a way I recognized instantly, professionally, and it terrified me more than anything Eleanor had said all afternoon. By the time we reached the emergency department at St. Vincent at 3:52 p.m., Mason's lips had a faint bluish cast. His skin was clammy, and he was struggling to keep his eyes open. I didn't wait in the lobby. I identified myself to the charge nurse, a woman named Carla I'd worked alongside for years, and within 90 seconds, Mason was on a gurney with a pulse oximeter clipped to his finger and a resident asking rapid-fire questions about exposure. "He had cake," I said, "at his grandmother's house. One bite before we left home, and maybe a bite there. I don't know. I didn't see him eat more." The attending, Dr. Okafor, ordered blood work immediately. Mason's oxygen saturation was dropping. His throat was beginning to swell. Within 12 minutes, they had him on epinephrine and a steroid drip, and I stood against the wall of that trauma bay with my hand pressed so hard against my own sternum I left a mark, watching my son's small chest rise and fall under fluorescent light, thinking about every batch of ingredients that had touched that cake, running the list in my head like a toxicology panel. I had not used a single nut product. I know this because I'm careful, because Mason has a documented moderate tree nut allergy that's been in his chart since he was 18 months old, an allergy that every single person in that family, including Eleanor, had been told about repeatedly at holiday after holiday for 4 years. The tox panel came back 40 minutes later. Trace almond protein, concentrated, present in his bloodstream at a level inconsistent with accidental cross-contamination. Dr. Okafor looked at me with the particular carefulness doctors use when they're about to say something they know will detonate a family. "This isn't consistent with trace exposure, Vanessa," she said. "Someone introduced a concentrated amount directly into food he consumed." I thought immediately of Bennett's security system, the one he'd had installed 2 years earlier after a string of break-ins on Green Tree Road. Cameras covering the kitchen, the side entrance, and the patio, all of it feeding to an app on his phone that I knew because Julian had shown me once, backed up to a cloud server for 90 days. Julian called his father from the hospital hallway at 5:15 p.m. Bennett, to his credit, didn't ask a single defensive question. He simply said, "Send me what you need me to look for," and forwarded the footage within the hour. The reveal. We watched it together on Julian's laptop in a family consultation room that smelled like hand sanitizer and old coffee. Eleanor, at 2:31 p.m., alone in the kitchen, 16 minutes before Mason carried that plate across the lawn. She'd checked the doorway twice. Then she'd taken a small amber dropper bottle from the pocket of her cardigan, the kind pharmacists like me recognize instantly, a concentrated almond extract, and administered 4 careful drops directly into the raspberry filling of the single slice she'd had Mason plate himself. Not the whole cake. One slice. His slice. Julian didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, she knew exactly what that would do to him. "I called the Lake Oswego Police Department at 6:40 p.m. Officer Reyes took our statement, reviewed the footage on scene, and confirmed what I already understood professionally, that this met the threshold for investigation as felony child endangerment, potentially attempted poisoning under Oregon statute. Mason was admitted overnight for observation. He was, by God's mercy and modern epinephrine, going to be fine. Eleanor was not. What came out over the following weeks was the part none of us had expected. The family truth buried under all of it. Bennett, shattered and searching for some explanation for what his wife of 43 years had done, went through her desk in the study on Green Tree Road and found a folder he'd never seen tucked behind old tax returns. Adoption paperwork sealed from a private agency in Salem, dated the year Julian was born. Julian was adopted. Eleanor had never told him. She had spent his entire childhood and the childhoods of his children constructing an idea of bloodline and legacy so rigid that she couldn't survive the truth that Julian himself had entered the family exactly the way Mason had entered ours, through love, not lineage. Bennett had known. Bennett had promised decades earlier to let her tell Julian in her own time. Her own time had never come. Instead, the closer Mason got to her, the more he threatened to expose, in some twisted internal ledger only she understood, a hierarchy of real family that had never actually existed at all. You are not my family, she told my son on that patio. She'd been talking to herself the entire time. She'd spent 40 years defending a bloodline that was never hers to defend in the first place. Eleanor was charged. She avoided prison through a plea agreement that included a permanent restraining order, mandated psychiatric evaluation, and 5 years of probation. She has not seen Mason since. Bennett filed for legal separation 11 weeks later. He told Julian, in the gentlest voice I've ever heard from that man, that he could forgive almost anything except watching his grandson's oxygen saturation drop on a hospital monitor because of a lie about who was allowed to be loved. Julian spent months afterward untangling 32 years of his own history, quietly, methodically, the way he untangles load calculations on a bridge deck, one variable at a time. He found his birth mother through the agency's records 6 months later. Her name is Diane. She lives outside Bend. They talk on the phone most Sundays now. Mason still asks sometimes if food is going to hurt his tummy again. I always kneel down to his exact height when I answer him, because I read once that children believe you more completely when your eyes are level with theirs. No, baby, I tell him, you never have to earn love by being perfect, and you never have to be afraid of the people who really love you. Last month, on a quiet Sunday, we baked another cake, lemon again, no raspberry this time. Mason iced it himself, badly, joyfully, sugar in his hair. He didn't ask me to carry it to anyone. He ate the first slice himself, sitting at our own kitchen table, and he smiled at me with frosting on his chin and said it was the best cake he'd ever had. It wasn't. My hands were shaking too badly that morning to get the batter quite right, but it was the first cake in 4 years that my son ate without fear, sitting beside him at the table, and I have never tasted anything sweeter than that.